My name is Norah Halverson, and I'm 34 years old. Last month, my mother knocked on my front door for the first time in 9 years. She was wearing a pale green coat I didn't recognize and holding a leather portfolio against her chest like it was a shield. No suitcase, no casserole, no photographs of the grandchildren she'd never met. Just that portfolio and a smile she'd clearly practiced in the rearview mirror on the drive in. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't ask how I was. She looked past me into the house, at the staircase and the good light coming through the kitchen, and the first full sentence out of her mouth was, "We should sit down. There are some things the family needs to discuss." The family. As if I'd been at the last 3 Thanksgivings. What my mother didn't know is that I'd been keeping something of my own for those 9 years. Not a list exactly, a box. My grandmother's cedar chest, the one she gave me before she died, sitting at the foot of my bed, and inside it, every birthday card my mother mailed back to me unopened, every Christmas card returned to sender, the letter she wrote me in the spring of the year I got married, the one with the line in it I could recite from memory. All of it stacked and stored and waiting, not because I was plotting anything, but because some part of me knew that one day she'd stand in front of me and rewrite all of it, and I wanted the truth where I could put my hands on it. She came to my door with a folder of demands. I had a chest full of answers. Before I take you back to the beginning, do me a small favor. If anything in this story lands somewhere true for you, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me what town you're watching from. I read every one, and I think you'll see why by the end. Now let me tell you about Calder, Nebraska, and the summer my family decided I wasn't theirs anymore. Calder sits about 90 minutes from anything you'd call a city. 1,800 people, give or take, a grain co-op, a Lutheran church with a steeple you could see from the highway, and a diner called the Bluebird, where the same 11 men have eaten breakfast at the same counter since before I was born. My whole world fit inside 5 square miles until I left for school. My father, Glenn, worked at the co-op for 26 years. He drove the grain trucks during harvest and ran the scales the rest of the time. And he came home every evening smelling like dust and diesel and the cold. He wasn't a talker. He showed love the way a lot of men out there do, which is to say he'd change your oil and check your tires and never once tell you he was worried about you driving home in the snow. My mother, Carol, ran the house and ran the church altar guild and in a quieter way ran the town. She knew who was getting divorced before the people getting divorced did. She decided the order of the funeral luncheons and which families got the good plots near the front during the Christmas pageant. Nobody crossed Carol Halverson because Carol Halverson remembered. My sister Bryn came along 3 years after me and got everything I didn't. The easy laugh. The way of walking into a room like it had been waiting for her. She made cheer squad, then captain. Mom drove her to competitions 4 hours each way and never missed one. I was the other kind of daughter, the one who got the academic medals nobody clapped that hard for, who did the dishes without being asked, who learned early that being useful was a different thing than being adored. I'm not telling you this to sound sorry for myself. I'm telling you so you understand the arithmetic of that house. Affection was a thing that got spent, and there was only ever enough for one of us at a time, and it was usually Bryn. When I was 18, I got a scholarship to study at a state university 4 hours east. First one in the family to go past the community college in the next county. My mother folded my clothes into a suitcase the night before I left, and she tucked a card into the side pocket without telling me. I found it on the drive. On the front were pressed flowers. Inside, in her careful slanted handwriting, she'd written, "The door is always open. You'll always have a home here." I kept that card. It's still in the cedar chest, right on top of everything else, because I want to remember that she wrote it. I want to remember that those words came out of the same hand that would later return my mail. I met Desmond Carter in the basement of the engineering building during my 2nd year, though neither of us was an engineer. The building had a coffee cart that stayed open late, and we were both there at 11 at night because we both worked days and studied nights. He was finishing a trade certification in HVAC and refrigeration and taking business classes on the side. I was working toward a degree in health administration and clocking 30 hours a week at a dental office to pay for the part the scholarship didn't. The first thing I noticed about Desmond was that he listened with his whole body. You'd say something ordinary like, the coffee was burnt, and he'd actually consider it, like your opinion on the coffee was worth weighing. He was the son of a postal worker from Gary, Indiana. His mother, Loretta, had raised him on her own after his father left when Desmond was small, and she'd done it on a mail carrier's salary and a refusal to let him become a statistic. He talked about her the way some people talk about a country they love. Desmond is black. I want to say that plainly because it's the hinge the whole story turns on, and it was the only thing about him my mother ever needed to know. Our first real date was at a taqueria that stayed open past midnight, and we split an order of nothing fancy and talked until they stacked the chairs around us. He told me he wanted to build something with his hands that would still be standing after he was gone. I told him I just wanted work where I felt like the math came out to something that mattered. He said those two things weren't as far apart as I thought. We dated for 2.5 years before he asked me to marry him, and in all that time I kept finding new corners of him to like. He was patient in a way I'd never seen modeled. He saved money like it was a moral practice. He called his mother every Sunday and meant it. He met my parents twice. The first time was at a steakhouse off the interstate, neutral ground, and my mother smiled the entire dinner without once letting that smile reach her eyes. She asked Desmond what his people did, which is a phrase I will never forget, what his people did. And when he said his mother was a retired letter carrier, she said, "How nice," in a tone that meant the opposite. My father shook Desmond's hand at the start and the end, and said maybe 40 words in between. On the drive back, Desmond didn't say anything for a long while, and then he said, "Your mom's a careful woman," which was the kindest possible way to describe what had just happened. The second time, my mother called him the young man the whole evening, never his name. The young man this, the young man that, like naming him would make him real. Bryn was the only one who told me the truth out loud. We were doing dishes at the sink after that second dinner, and she dried a glass and said, low so Mom couldn't hear, "You know she's never going to be okay with it. You get that, right?" And I said something about how they just needed time, and Bryn looked at me with a kind of pity that I've thought about a lot since, and she said, "It's not time she needs, Norah." Desmond proposed on a Sunday afternoon at the lake near campus. No big production, just the two of us on a bench, and a ring he'd been paying off in pieces for half a year. He said he didn't have a lot yet, but he had a plan, and a good back, and 20 years of work in him, and would I build the rest of it with him? I said yes before he finished asking. I called home that night. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her, and there was a silence on the line that went on so long I thought we'd been cut off. Then she said, "Have you thought about what this does to us, Norah?" Not congratulations, not tell me about him, what this does to us. My father picked up the other extension and breathed, and cleared his throat, and didn't manage a single word. 2 days later, a letter came. My mother didn't email. She wrote letters, on the cream stationery with her monogram at the top, and she wrote 4 paragraphs, and I can still see the last one. She wrote, "If you marry this man, you are choosing him over your family, and you cannot have both. We will not be there. We will not pretend to celebrate something that breaks my heart. He is not one of us, and he never will be, and you knew that, and you did it anyway. He is not one of us." She underlined "one of us." She pressed so hard, the pen tore the paper a little. I read that letter standing in my kitchen, and then I read it again, and then I did the thing that started everything. I folded it back into its envelope, and I put it in a drawer, because some instinct I didn't understand yet told me to keep it. I didn't keep it to use it. I kept it because it was true, and I was afraid that someday I'd convince myself it hadn't happened. We got married at the county courthouse on a Thursday morning the following June. 11 guests, all of them friends or Desmond's family. Loretta flew in from Indiana with a dress in a garment bag, and a sheet cake in a cooler, and a small box of her mother's costume jewelry, and she pinned a brooch to my dress and held both my hands and said, "You're mine now too, baby. That's how this works." There was no father to walk me down anything. There wasn't even an aisle. There was a hallway that smelled like floor wax, and a clerk who read our vows off a laminated card. And afterward, we ate barbecue at a place with picnic tables, and Desmond's college roommate gave a toast that made Loretta laugh so hard she had to sit down. My dress cost $90 off a clearance rack. Desmond wore a gray suit he'd had since his cousin's wedding. We looked exactly like what we were, which was two people who had just done the most serious thing of their lives, without much money, and without half of the people who were supposed to be there. That night I sat on the edge of our bed in our one-bedroom apartment, and I looked at the grocery store flowers Desmond had bought me, and I cried. Not because I had any doubt. I cried because I'd just gotten married, and the two people who raised me had decided that watching it would cost them too much. A week later I mailed a card home. Our wedding photo tucked inside, the two of us on the courthouse steps grinning like fools. I wrote, "We're happy. I hope someday you'll want to be happy for us." It came back 11 days later with a red stamp across the front. Return to sender. I stood at the mailbox holding it for a long time. Then I went inside, and I took out the manila folder with the letter in it, and I put the returned card next to it, and that's the day I started filling the cedar chest. Not with anger. With evidence, though I couldn't have told you then what I was building a case for. The first year was the hardest, and I want to be honest about how it actually went, because people think estrangement is one big dramatic break, and then it's over. It isn't. It's 1,000 small choices to keep trying, followed by 1,000 small refusals. I called my mother 4 times that first year. Voicemail every time. I left messages where I weighed every word, because you write a voicemail differently when you suspect it might be the last one she ever lets herself hear. I'd say I was doing well. I'd say Desmond got hired on at a heating and cooling outfit. I'd say I missed her, and the door was open on my end. She never called back. I sent a birthday card, and it came home with the red stamp. I sent a Christmas card, and it came home with the red stamp. My father sent one text, that whole first year. 3 words. "Take care, kiddo." I saved it. I still have it. It's the only thing my father ever sent me in 9 years, and I've read it more times than I'd admit to anyone. Desmond and I scraped through those early years the way young couples do. We lived small. We saved hard. And the whole time, Desmond was studying the thing nobody else in his trade was paying attention to: geothermal. Ground source heating and cooling, the kind where you drill down deep and let the earth do half the work. It was expensive to install, and almost nobody in the region offered it, and Desmond looked at that and saw a door that nobody else had tried the handle on. In the 3rd year, he took out a small business loan, bought a used truck and a drilling rig at auction, and started Carter Climate out of the garage of the little rental house we'd moved into. I kept the books at the kitchen table after my shifts at the dental office. Our daughter was born that same year. We named her Junie, after Loretta's mother, June. 2 years after that came our son Eli, and here's the thing my own mother will have to live with for the rest of her life. She never met them. Not as babies. Not ever. I mailed birth announcements both times. Both times the envelopes came back unopened, the red stamp slapped across our children's faces like a verdict. But the children had a grandmother. Her name was Loretta Carter, and she flew out from Indiana 3 or 4 times a year and stayed for a week each time and never once missed a birthday. The kids called her Grandma Retta. She taught Junie to make biscuits from memory. No measuring cups, just her hands and her mother's recipe. She taught Eli the names of the birds at our feeder and tested him on them until he knew the difference between a chickadee and a nuthatch at 5 years old. When I think about the word grandmother, I don't picture Carol Halverson. I picture Loretta on our back step with a kid on each knee, the 3 of them watching for cardinals. Around year 4, Bryn texted a woman we both knew from high school, and that woman screenshotted it and sent it to me without a word of comment, because she thought I should know. Bryn had written, "My sister's kids don't really have grandparents on our side. That was her choice, not ours." I sat with that one for a while. Her choice. as if I had chosen to have my children erased. I printed that screenshot and I put it in the chest. Not because I wanted to nurse the wound, because I'd promised myself that when Junie and Eli were old enough to ask why they didn't have a Grandma and Grandpa Halverson, I would have the actual record. Not my version, not Carol's version, the receipts. Desmond asked me once why I kept all of it. He'd seen me come in from the mailbox and go straight to the bedroom with another returned envelope. I told him the truth. I said, because someday somebody's going to tell our kids this was complicated, that there was fault on both sides, and I want to be able to open this box and show them exactly how complicated it was. Desmond understood that better than anyone, because Desmond builds things for a living, and a man who builds things keeps a record of every measurement. He nodded, and he never asked again. If you've ever kept a box like that, a drawer, a folder on your phone, anything, drop a comment and tell me. I used to feel a little crazy about it. I don't anymore, and I think a lot of you will understand why. By year 5, Carter Climate had grown out of the garage and into a real shop with a real sign and 11 people on payroll. Desmond still did installs himself most days because he refused to become the kind of owner who forgot what the work felt like. I'd left the dental office by then and taken over the business side full-time. The cash flow, the bids, the payroll, the contracts with the county and the school district when they started converting their buildings over to geothermal to cut their energy costs. The company was his vision. The numbers were mine. We were partners in the way that married people who run a business together either become partners or come apart, and we'd become partners. We bought our first house that year, a 2-story on a corner lot with a porch and a maple tree in the front that turned the color of a stoplight every October. I remember signing the closing papers and thinking, nobody gave us this. Not one person from Calder lifted a finger. We built it with our own hands and our own nights, and it was ours. That was also the year my mother started watching. It came to me sideways, the way everything from Calder came to me, through a friend named Dot who'd known me since grade school and still went to the Lutheran church. Dot called one evening and said, kind of careful, "Hey, this is probably nothing, but your mom asked me at coffee hour whether your husband's company was doing well. She wanted to know if you all were comfortable. I just thought it was strange, after all this time." It was strange. My mother hadn't said my name in 5 years, and now she was taking the company's temperature over coffee in the church basement. Year 6 is the year I should warn you gets hard, so if you're somewhere you can't sit with that, maybe save the rest for later. That was the year my father died. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday in February, out at the co-op, between the scale house and his truck. He was 61. He didn't make it to the hospital, and I didn't find out until 4 days later when a cousin I barely knew sent me a message that started, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and I read those words not knowing what loss she meant. Nobody called me. Nobody texted. My mother buried my father, the man who taught me to drive and changed my oil, and once sat up all night with me when I had the flu at 9 years old, and she did it without telling me he was gone. I drove to Calder for the first time in 6 years. I drove all night. I got to the funeral home as they were closing up after the visitation, and the director, an old man who'd known my dad, let me in to stand by the casket alone for 10 minutes after hours. I'd missed the service by a day. My mother had held it fast, and I will always believe she held it fast on purpose, so there'd be no chance of me standing up in that church beside my sister. I didn't go to the house. I didn't have it in me. I drove the 4 hours home in the dark, and Desmond was awake when I got there, sitting on the porch under the maple, and he didn't say anything. He just stood up and held on to me, and we stayed out there until the sun came up. I sent a sympathy card to my mother that week. My own mother for my own father. I wrote that I was sorry I missed it, that I'd loved him, that I wished things were different. It came back 11 days later with the red stamp. I added it to the chest. That's the only item in there I've never been able to look at twice. So when people ask me, later, how I could be so cold to my mother, I think about that card. I think about driving all night to stand next to a closed casket because she couldn't stand to let me grieve in the same room as her. There's a kind of cruelty that's so total it stops feeling like it's even about you. It's just who the person is. Now here's where the numbers come in, because the numbers are the whole reason my mother ever knocked on my door. Year 7, Carter Climate hit a wall most small companies dream about hitting. We had 40 employees and contracts across 3 counties, and the state passed a clean energy incentive that turned geothermal from a luxury into a no-brainer for every school district and municipal building in our region. Overnight, we couldn't keep up with demand. A regional builder came to us about a partnership, then a bigger one. Desmond was profiled in a trade magazine that called him the quiet operator who saw it coming. It wasn't a national story. It was the kind of thing that the people in our industry noticed and everyone else scrolled past. But somebody in Calder noticed. Dot called again. Your mom asked me what an acquisition was, she said. At coffee hour. She'd read something online and she wanted to know if it meant you were selling the company. I didn't know what to tell her. My mother, who hadn't been to my wedding, who hadn't met my children, who hadn't told me my own father was dying, was now teaching herself the vocabulary of mergers. That was the year I sent my last card. I'd sent one every birthday, 7 years running, 7 red stamps. But that year I tucked a photo inside. Junie and Eli at the fall festival, both of them with painted faces, Eli grinning with his 2 front teeth missing. On the back I wrote, "They ask about you sometimes. I tell them you live a long way off." I expected the red stamp. It came back, but it was different. The envelope had been opened, the flap was torn and then taped shut again, carefully, with a strip of clear tape. The photo was still inside. Someone had taken it out, looked at it, and put it back, and then sent it home to me. I held that envelope up to the light at my kitchen table for a long time. Somebody in that house had held my children's faces in their hands, and I knew, with a certainty I can't fully explain, that it had been my mother, alone now, sitting at her kitchen table opening the one card she'd let herself open, and then making herself send it back anyway, because to keep it would have meant admitting that all of it had been a mistake. That she'd buried her husband estranged from his daughter for nothing. I put that one in the chest too. The opened, resealed envelope. Of everything in there, it's the item that tells you the most about her, because it's the only one where you can see her hesitate. Year 8. The acquisition talks got real. A national clean energy firm wanted Carter Climate, the whole thing, the contracts and the crews and Desmond's name on a non-compete. The lawyers flew in. There were rooms full of people in suits going through 8 years of our books, and the books they were going through were the books I'd built at a kitchen table after my shifts. I sat in those meetings as a co-owner and a chief operating officer, and my name was on every page they cared about. Around that time I noticed strange things on the edges of my life. Somebody from Calder kept viewing my page on a professional networking site, a handful of times in a single week, no name attached. Then Bryn, who hadn't spoken to me in 8 years, sent a friend request on Facebook. I didn't accept it. A week later, she found a way to message me anyway, through a group we both belonged to from high school, and she wrote, "Hey stranger, been thinking about you. The kids must be getting big. Would love to catch up sometime." 8 years of silence, and would love to catch up. I knew the shape of it. I'd seen my mother run this play on half the town. You don't apologize. You just act like the silence was a thing that happened to both of you, like weather, and you ease back in through the side door. I didn't answer for a few days. I wanted to see if she'd push. She did. A second message. "I might be passing through your way next month for a conference. Coffee?" There was no conference. Bryn had never been to a conference in her life. But I said yes, because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before it arrived at my door, and I figured Bryn would tell me more than she meant to. We met at a coffee shop downtown. I picked it on purpose. Public, neutral, the kind of place where nobody makes a scene. Bryn showed up 15 minutes late, in clothes nicer than she used to wear, and she hugged me too long, and she told me I looked amazing more times than anyone means it. Then the questions started. How big was the house? Did the kids go to private school? What did the acquisition mean for us exactly? Was it a lump sum or did Desmond stay on? How many people did the company employ now? Did we own it outright or were there investors? She asked me 28 questions about money and not one about my father, whose funeral she'd helped my mother schedule, and not one that started with the word, sorry. Halfway through, I caught her reflection in the window. She had her phone out below the table, angled toward the parking lot, and she was photographing my car. I let her finish her latte. I answered everything vaguely and politely, the way you answer a stranger making small talk on a plane. When we hugged goodbye, she held on too long again, and she said, "We should really do this more." And I thought, this was reconnaissance. And I drove home and wrote down the date and what she'd asked and put it in the chest. A week later, the thing that confirmed everything fell into my lap. Dot called, sounding shaken. "Norah, I have to tell you something. Bryn added me to a group text by accident. I think she meant another Dot. There's two of us at church. I was in it for 2 days before they noticed. I took screenshots. You should see them." She sent me 11 screenshots. 2 days of my family's private conversation, with me as a ghost in the room. I read them in the parking lot of Junie's swim practice with the engine off. Bryn had written about the acquisition, that she'd been tracking the news and figured the company sold for somewhere north of 50 million, and that our personal share had to be in the millions. My mother had written, "How do we approach her? She won't listen to me." Bryn had written, "Make a plan. A real number. She's a numbers person, she'll respond to numbers." My mother had asked how much, and Bryn had written, "Start with what they owe us. 18 years of raising her. Then the house repairs mom needs, then your medical, then something set aside for me and the kids. Frame it as the family finally pulling together. Don't call it a handout." And then my mother had written the line that I will hear in her voice until the day I die. She wrote, "Glenn always said blood comes back around. She'll do right by her family in the end." She used my dead father, the father she never told me was dying, to plan how to ask me for money. I sat in that car with my hands shaking on the wheel, watching Junie through the chain-link fence kicking off the wall in lane 3. I wasn't sad. I was clear. 9 years of silence, a returned sympathy card for my own father, 2 children erased from existence, and now there was a plan. A real number. Framed as family finally pulling together. I drove home and printed the screenshots and put them in the chest with all the rest. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat on the floor in front of that cedar chest, and I opened it, and I took everything out, one item at a time, and I laid it across the bedroom floor. The card with the pressed flowers, the torn letter, 9 years of returned mail, the unopened one still sealed, the sympathy card, the screenshot from year 4, the screenshots from the group text. Desmond found me there. He sat down on the floor next to me and looked at it all laid out, and after a while he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Nothing yet, but when she comes, I want to be ready." If this is hitting close to home, if someone in your life went quiet and then came back the moment your situation changed, tell me about it in the comments. I think more of us are carrying this than we ever say out loud. And if this story's holding you, go ahead and subscribe, because the part you came for is next. I called a lawyer that week. Not to sue anyone. I wanted to understand where I stood if my mother showed up and tried to make a claim. On the money, on the kids, on anything. The lawyer, a woman named Pat with 30 years on her, walked me through it in 20 minutes. My mother had no legal standing of any kind. The acquisition proceeds were ours. The trusts we'd already set up for Junie and Eli were locked, and no grandparent in our state can claim visitation when there's never been a relationship to begin with, and 9 years of documented estrangement made the idea of one laughable. Pat said, "You don't need me for this, Norah. The legal side is already buttoned up. What you're describing isn't a legal problem. It's a personal one. You just have to decide what you want to say to her." She was right. This was never going to be settled by lawyers. It was going to be settled in my kitchen, between me and the woman who taught me that love is something you spend on the child who makes you look good. The acquisition closed on a Friday in September. I won't tell you the exact number because the exact number isn't the point, but I'll tell you it was the kind of money that doesn't feel real, the kind that looks like a typo on a statement. Our share, after everyone got paid and the taxes were carved out, came to a little over $19 million. I'd built the spreadsheet that produced that figure, and even I had to check it twice. The local paper ran a small story. Hometown geothermal company acquired in regional deal. There was a photo of Desmond and me standing in front of the shop with the crew. The story got picked up by a trade newsletter. It wasn't national news, but it was enough. The first call came 9 days after the story ran. Area code I hadn't seen in years. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then a text from Bryn, the first direct one in 9 years. Saw the news about Desmond's company. So proud of you guys. Mom would love to hear from you. Call her? So proud of you guys. Mom would love to hear from you. As if my mother had been sitting by the phone for 9 years instead of returning my father's funeral card. Then the long one came, from my mother's number, and you could tell she'd written it the way she wrote the disownment letter, drafted and edited and read aloud to herself. It said, Norah, I know there's been distance between us. Not a day goes by that I don't think about you and the children. Life is short. I learned that with your father, and I've come to believe that family matters more than the things that drove us apart. I would like to talk, face to face, about the future, about the children, about what it means to be a family again. I believe there's a way forward if you're willing to find it with me. I read it 3 times and counted the words, and it was 81 of them, and not one of them was sorry. Not one of them was I was wrong. She wrote, the things that drove us apart. Like our estrangement was a disagreement about politics, instead of her writing, he is not one of us, in pen so hard it tore the page. She wrote that life is short, and she'd learned it with my father, and she had the nerve to put my father in that sentence, the funeral she didn't invite me to. I didn't reply. I printed it and I put it in the chest, on top, where the flower card used to sit. Dot called one more time, the Friday before it happened. I have to warn you, she said. Bryn's telling everyone at church you live in a mansion now, and that you drive a Tesla and the kids are in private school. And Norah, your mother bought a plane ticket. She's coming out there next week. I heard her tell Linda at the salon. I closed my eyes. I know, I said. How do you know? Because Bryn counted the rooms in a coffee shop and took a picture of my car, I said. She's coming to collect, and I'm going to let her. You're going to let her in? I'm going to let her talk, I said, and then I'm going to show her what I've been keeping at the foot of my bed for 9 years. Here's a thing about a town like Calder that my mother forgot. News travels through the church there like water through cracked ground. Slow, but it gets everywhere, and you can't stop it. 9 years ago, when I married Desmond, the Whisper Network did its work in a weekend. Carol Halverson's girl married a black man, and the women on the altar guild clucked, and the men at the Bluebird shook their heads, and my mother used all of that pressure like a tool. She didn't just disown me out of her own conviction. She did it partly because she couldn't stand the whispers, and disowning me publicly was how she stayed on the right side of them. But the whispers had turned around on her. By the time she bought that plane ticket, the same town that had clucked at my wedding was now asking her, to her face, when she was going out to visit those grandkids, whether she'd seen the article, whether she was so proud. And she had to smile through all of it, because the truth, that she'd cut off her own daughter for marrying the wrong man and stayed cut off straight through her husband's funeral, would have ruined the careful version of herself she'd spent a decade building. The pressure that once worked for her was working against her now, and there's a justice in that I didn't have to lift a finger for. She arrived on a Wednesday at 10:20 in the morning. I know the time because I was at the kitchen window drying a coffee mug when the rideshare pulled up to the curb. She got out slowly, the pale green coat, hair grayer than I remembered, more gray than the woman in Bryn's Facebook photos, like she'd let it go in the last year. She stood on the sidewalk and she looked at the house, the porch, the maple, and I watched her take it in the way an appraiser walks a property. Then she came up the walk holding that leather portfolio against her chest, and she rang the bell. I opened the door. We stood there about 3 feet apart, and for a second neither of us said anything. Her eyes were already wet, and her eyes are the same gray as mine, and I hated that. "Norah," she said. "Mom!" "I came to talk about the family's future," she said. "Not I came because I missed you. Not I came because I was wrong. Not even I came because I love you. The family's future. The family that didn't include me at a single Thanksgiving, or the children she'd never laid eyes on." I looked at the portfolio. "Come in," I said. I didn't take her to the living room. The living room is where you put guests. I took her to the kitchen, because the kitchen is where the truth lives in my house. It's got the good light and the table and the refrigerator covered in the kids' drawings and a photo of Grandma Retta with a kid on each knee. I poured 2 glasses of water. I didn't make coffee. Coffee is for people who are staying. She sat down and set the portfolio on the table and looked around the kitchen, and her eyes landed on the photo of Loretta on the fridge, and I watched her understand what it was, and I watched her decide not to ask. "You have a beautiful home," she said. "We built it," I said. "What's in the folder, Mom?" She'd clearly meant to work up to it, to do the part about family first and the part about money later, and I'd taken that away from her, and I could see her recalculate. She opened the portfolio. Inside was a single typed page, neat, formatted with headings, and across the top it said, "Family Reconciliation and Support Plan." She slid it across the table to me. I read it. There were line items: reimbursement for the cost of raising me, which she'd put at $190,000. Repairs and upkeep on the family home, her medical expenses going forward, a monthly support figure, a college fund for Bryn's son, my nephew, who I'd never met. And at the bottom, a total. $640,000. She'd typed me an invoice for my childhood and called it reconciliation. "I know it looks like a lot," she said when she saw my face. "But you have to understand, this is what families do. They help each other. And after everything we gave you growing up, the clothes, the school, the roof over your head, I don't think it's wrong to ask you to help your family now that you're able." "You gave me a card that said the door's always open," I said. "And then you wrote me a letter telling me not to come back." She started to say something. I held up a hand and I got up from the table. And I went to the bedroom and I came back with the cedar chest. It's heavy, and I set it on the table next to her invoice, and she looked at it and didn't know what it was. "You brought a list," I said. "I want to show you what I brought." I opened it. I started taking things out, the same way I'd laid them on the floor a few weeks before, but slower now, in front of her. The flower card first. "You wrote this the night before I left for school," I said, and I put it down in front of her. "The door is always open. You'll always have a home here. Do you remember writing that?" She didn't answer. I took out the letter, the torn one. I unfolded it, and I laid it next to the card. "And then you wrote this," I said. "He is not one of us, and he never will be." You underlined it. You pressed so hard you tore the paper. I tapped the rip in the page. "Look, you can still see where you tore it." Her hand came up to her mouth. I took out the returned cards, one at a time, the sealed ones, and I made a stack. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3, I kept going, each one with the red stamp, each one in her own handwriting on the front, my address, the stamp, the line of red. "These are the birthday cards and Christmas cards I mailed you. You never opened most of them. You sent them back. 9 years of them. They're all here." "Norah," she said. I took out the one from Year 7, the opened one, the one with the flap torn and taped shut again. I set it down on top of the stack, and I left it facing her. "This one you opened," I said. "There was a picture inside, of Junie and Eli at the fall festival. You took it out. You looked at it. and then you taped the envelope back up and you sent it home to me. I've always wondered what you were thinking, sitting there with their faces in your hands." My voice didn't shake. I'd thought it might. "Was it you? Or was it Dad?" She looked at the taped envelope for a long moment, and then something happened that I didn't expect. Her face came apart. Just for a second or two, the careful, composed thing she'd practiced in the car fell off, and underneath it was something raw, and she whispered, "It was me. Your father wanted to keep it. He had it on the dresser for 3 days, and I made him send it back, because if I let one thing in, I'd have to let it all in, and then I'd have to know what I'd done." She pressed her hand flat on the table. "I'd have to know I lost all of it for nothing." For 2 seconds, maybe 3, I saw the actual woman in there, the one who'd folded my clothes the night before I left. I saw fear, the real kind, the kind that's been buried under pride so long it's forgotten how to come out any other way, and then it was gone. Her chin came up, and her spine straightened, and the composed thing slid back over her face, and she said, "But you left, Norah. You made a choice. I had to live with what you did to this family." The moment of honesty was gone, like steam off a cup. I took out the last thing, the sympathy card, the one I'd sent her when Dad died, the one I'd never been able to look at twice. I set it down in front of her, red stamp up. "You buried my father without telling me he was sick," I said. "I drove all night and I missed the service by a day because you held it fast on purpose. And when I sent you this, my own father, you sent it back too." I put the group text screenshots down beside it. "And then, the second the company sold, you sat down with Bryn and you made a plan, a real number. You told her Glenn always said blood comes back around. You used my dead father to figure out how to ask me for $640,000. She went white. "Where did you get those?" "It doesn't matter," I said. I closed the cedar chest. I set my hand on the lid. "You didn't come here because you missed me, Mom. You came because the number changed. For 9 years I wasn't worth a phone call. Now I'm worth a flight and a typed-up invoice." The garage door rumbled at the back of the house. A minute later, Desmond came in through the laundry room with his keys in his hand, still in his work clothes from a morning install, and he stopped when he saw her at the table, and he saw the chest and the invoice and my face. He didn't say a single word. He set his keys down, and he came across the kitchen, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he sat down in the chair beside me. That was all. No speech. No confrontation. A man sitting down next to his wife because she needed him there. My mother looked at him. The man she'd refused to say the name of 9 years ago. He was in a Carter Climate work shirt with dirt on his boots and a wedding ring she'd never seen on his hand, and there was nothing about him that looked like $19 million. He was just a man, a good one, her son-in-law for 9 years, whether she'd allowed it or not. And he was right there, his hand on my shoulder, saying everything without opening his mouth. I watched her understand it. I didn't need the Halversons. I'd built a family already, and it had been standing here the whole time. "I'm not going to give you the money, Mom," I said. I said it the way you read a final figure off a closed account. "Not because I can't afford it. Because the day I write you a check is the day you get to tell yourself you were right to stay away until it paid off. You'll tell yourself the silence was a misunderstanding. You'll tell the whole church the 9 years were just a rough patch, and now the family's back together. And it wasn't a rough patch. It was a choice. Yours. Every returned card, every birthday you missed, Dad's funeral. You chose all of it." She reached for the invoice and pulled it back toward her chest. "After everything we did for you," she started. "You raised me," I said. "That's not a debt I owe you. That's the thing parents are supposed to do. You don't get to send your daughter a bill for it 9 years later because she finally has money." She had no answer for that. I watched her go looking for one, flipping through every guilt trip and Bible verse and family obligation she'd ever used on this town, and finding nothing that fit. "You told me he wasn't one of us," I said, and I nodded at Desmond. But his mother is the only grandmother my children have ever known. For 9 years, while you were sending back their photographs, Loretta Carter was flying out here to teach them to make biscuits. You missed all of it, Mom, and there's no check that buys it back. She stood up. The chair scraped on the tile. She gathered the invoice and the portfolio against her chest, and she walked to the front door, and at the door she stopped and turned around, and I thought she might finally say it, the one word. She opened her mouth, and she said, "Your father would be so disappointed in you." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was the last card in her hand, and she'd played it, my father again, the man she'd buried without me. "My father sent me one text in 9 years," I said. 3 words. "Take care, kiddo. I've got it saved. It's the kindest thing anybody in that house ever sent me, and he sent it behind your back, because he was afraid of you. So no, Mom, I don't think Dad's disappointed in me. I think Dad was sorry. I just never got the chance to hear him say it, because you wouldn't let him." She stood there a second longer. Then she turned and opened the door and walked out, and she pulled it shut behind her. Not a slam, a click. The quiet sound a person makes leaving a house when they've finally understood there's nothing here they can take with them. Desmond's hand was still on my shoulder. We sat in the kitchen with the chest open on the table, and we didn't say anything for a while. Then he reached over and started putting the cards back in, gently, in order, and I helped him, and we closed the lid together. If somebody only came back into your life after your circumstances changed, I want to hear it. Put it in the comments. And if this reminded you that what you're worth was never a number on somebody else's spreadsheet, send it to a person who needs to hear that today. 2 weeks went by. The kids never knew she'd come. They were at school both times, when she arrived and when she left, and I wanted it that way. They'll learn about Carol Halverson when they're old enough to understand that some people can only see you when there's something in it for them. Bryn texted once. 1 line. "Mom's heartbroken. I hope you can live with what you did." I read it, and I set the phone down, and I didn't answer. Because some messages are their own answer, and because I noticed she still hadn't said sorry, and she still hadn't asked about the kids, and she never would. My mother didn't call again. The silence came back. But this time it was hers to sit in, and I'd already said everything I needed to say. The cedar chest is back at the foot of my bed. I didn't add the invoice to it. I shredded that. There are 9 years of cards in there, and a torn letter, and a taped-up envelope, and 3 words from my father, and I haven't opened it since the day she sat at my table. I don't think I'll need to again. Here's what 9 years taught me, and then I'll let you go. Family isn't the people who share your last name. It isn't the people who show up when the number on your statement gets big enough to be worth the gas money. Family is the woman who flew out from Indiana 3 times a year to teach your daughter her mother's biscuit recipe. It's the man who sat down next to you without a word because you needed him there. It's the people who showed up when your house was small and the company was still in the garage and your babies needed somebody, anybody, to call grandma. That's family. It was never about the money. It was about who chose to walk through the door and who chose to send it back. That's my story. 9 years, 1 cedar chest, and a mother who came back with a folder. If it reminded you that your worth was never up for negotiation, do me that favor I asked for at the start. Subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I'll see you in the next one.